following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome to the first edition of Thrown from a Moving Vehicle with Steve Goldleaf. I'm Ralph Tyko with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and it is my pleasure to introduce the man himself, Steve Goldleaf. How are you, sir?
Terrific. I wanted to maybe give a little background on what I'm doing in calling the show by the title that we are, and that is simply that my little brother, Michael, he's 62 years old, just decided to offer to throw me out of a moving car on the Taconic State Parkway. We were driving together. I was driving, so it was a dangerous move for my brother to make. And he just said, if I don't shut up about baseball with all my crazy ideas, he's going to lose his mind and he's going to probably put us both to death. So
now it didn't scare you too much
my
because
brother.
you still got the crazy ideas. What year was this? Do you remember?
Oh, this is probably about 10 years ago or so.
Okay.
And
it hasn't curtailed you in any way. Tell us a little bit about what you do and your work with Bill James.
Sure. So what I've been doing with that concept is I was offered a chance to write a regular column for Bill James Online, which is Bill James's website, that he discusses a sabermetric approach to baseball. And it's a very lively, interesting discussion. Bill just felt that he was being overworked as far as providing the articles, which he does with a lot of facility, but it still really isn't enough to keep the website going. So he offered a couple of people, me among them, the chance to write these columns that work out to around twice a month. And
what high praise from the guru of analytic baseball.
I got an even better compliment earlier this month. I was reviewing Jane Levy's book, which we discussed maybe
we discussed this on the George Case show a couple of weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that, just about 2 weeks. And somebody wrote on Jane's Twitter feed that what a great review Bill James gave her. That was, such an outstanding review and from such a thoughtful baseball writer. And I just wrote on her Twitter feed that I've never gotten a greater compliment. I mean, Bill is a wonderful writer as well as being the guru of modern analytics. So I can die happy now.
Okay, beautiful.
At my writing.
What did you like most about Jane's book? Just we talked about it at length, but some of the listeners may not have heard that edition on Comfortably Zoned.
I just thought it was very gutsy of her to even attempt another biography of Ruth, who's probably the most famous player ever and has had at least 4 or 5 biographies written already. And she just dug up some really fresh material. Some of it is so hot that it is capable of singeing your eyebrows. Some of it is shocking in a way. And she also decided that she wasn't going to write about the normal Babe Ruth hagiography stuff. She mostly wrote about what Ruth did in his off-season that helped him brand himself as a celebrity, which was basically playing baseball in small towns. And that's mostly what she wrote a lot of her details about Ruth's life after he was 18 or so. She paid some attention to the regular stories, the 60 home runs and the contract disputes and all that. But for the most part, she was, paying attention to stuff that really hadn't gotten written about nearly as much up to that point. And, she's a really
fine writer. You talked about his barnstorming days with Lou Gehrig and how that was such a big part of his image, of promoting him, of supplementing the baseball income, which even Babe Ruth didn't make as much money as he deserved. If being the highest paid player, he saved baseball.
Well, he did, and he also made a good buck for himself in the off season. In fact, one of the interesting things that Jane points out is that Ruth earned more money some years playing baseball in these small towns, where he was obviously taking in the large part of the gate and paying out expenses to the other players. But he cleared more money in the off season than he did in the on season. Of course, he was the most highly paid major league player of his time by a long shot. So that was one way in he was able to create.
I'm skipping around here, but I want to ask you. I want to ask you this. I wanted to a few minutes ago, and I don't want to forget. Why don't you tell us what the main reason that Bill James picked you, among others, but chose you? What are your qualifications? What's your background? And this will give the audience a good idea, because I know what your background is. I know what your qualifications are. And I want you to sing praises to yourself a little bit, because you are terrifically qualified.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I think the main qualification he decided to give me this offer was just the stories that I submitted to him. I gave him a couple of pieces that I'd written and published before. I've been a writer for longer than I like to think about. For about 40 years, I've been getting my stuff published in popular journals and in some academic journals. I've written a couple of books about American writers, and I just have another one coming out this month where I edited the first 4 novels of John O'Hara for the Library of America. So I've been able to write with a lot of facility over the years, and I just think it was the writing that made Bill think that this guy not only knew a little bit about baseball, but I wouldn't have any problem coming up with material on deadline. And as I'm saying, he was mostly interested in just having some readable writers on his website. So that was pretty much the basis for the choice. I don't think that he was all that impressed by my advanced degrees. In fact, I think that's probably something of a negative for Bill. He's an iconoclast, as you know, and he doesn't like the whole idea of anybody having credentials or expertise. So I didn't even make that a big part of my application. I just gave him a couple of stories that I'd written, fictional pieces about baseball and baseball players.
Okay. How did you develop your passion for baseball? Where did that get started?
I guess like everybody else, I just loved baseball when I was a kid. And I grew up in Brooklyn. My father was a big Dodgers fan. Dodgers were gone by the time I came to any kind of consciousness, but I certainly heard a lot about them. And there was a new team in town that was playing the Polo Grounds that I started following almost from the beginning. And it's just been something that's triggered my imagination. I mean, when I was, 9 years old or something like that, I wrote an epic poem in which the idea of the poem was simply to show how in verse the Mets would come back from a gigantic deficit on hits by Eddie Kranepool and Jim Hickman and the like, and it just captured my imagination, just that I could write about this, even though that was very unlikely to actually happen, but I could make it happen if I could set it down on paper.
Right. And if you can do it in your head, you can transpose it to anything. That's wonderful. To get to know you a little bit more, what would if you didn't have baseball in your life, where would have you gravitated for your I'd like to say passion, but not just passion, for your intellectual gratification?
Yeah, well, I mean, even more than baseball, I would say that writing is really what my life is about. That it's the whole idea of applying some sort of rational thought and systematization to almost any discipline at all. So really, what I do even when I'm not writing is I'm just trying to make sense of the world around me. And I think that writing is a way to do that, such that when I've figured out something that makes some sense to me about the world, that I put it down on paper, just so I have a record of it, just so I can go back and look at it and check it out against later thoughts that I might have. And that's really all writing is. It's just really a record of one's thinking. And that's really where most of my energy goes. Do you journal on a regular basis? I don't. I mean, I think what my journaling is stories that I've started or pieces that I've started researching, and sometimes they don't go anywhere. Sometimes it's not really a fruitful exercise, but I guess that amounts to journaling. Most of the time, I manage to turn them into articles, and actually, that's really where the Bill James gig has done me a lot of good.
Okay, I want to ask you a little bit about the process you go through when you write. Do you make like an appointment with yourself to sit down for X number of hours at a precise time and get X number of words down, or do you write when the spirit moves you? What's the creative process for you?
Yeah, I'm not really much of a schedule guy. I'm really more of a writer who fits it into spare moments. I mean, I've been for the last 30-odd years professor, and I've had periods when, I had nothing to do other than, grade papers and enter grades and serve on committees and stuff like that. And then there are long vacation periods, and I guess I try to shoehorn as much writing into those periods when I've got long stretches that I can do writing, as opposed to periods when all I can do is really, just jot down ideas and hope I can find a couple hours to work them out.
Okay. You recently retired. And I'm an old retired guy myself, what's semi-retired, semi-retarded too, I might add for myself, but what is the transition from the workaday schedule to adjusting to a lot of the free time? Has that been easy for you, or are you like spinning your wheels sometime in neutral?
Well, it's a little bit scary, but I'm still in the process. I'm in the middle of a 2-year period of semi-retirement. I just handed in grades on December 21st, so really just at the start of a 9-month period until the fall, when I've got no fixed schedule. And, it's definitely a challenge. I'm sure you could probably tell me more than I can tell you about how you cope with all of this suddenly free time. But,
it's not easy. I'm
not
thinking not just from our experience, a lot of people struggle with this. And it seems like with nothing to do, and I use that in quotes, it gives folks a lower sense of self-worth, and I just try to avoid that. My only tip is just trying to keep it going, keep my brain going every day. And, that's what it's about for me. But it's interesting to me to see how people adjust, people that worked hard all their lives and now don't have that purpose. And a writer never goes, we've talked about this before, a writer really never has to go through that because you always can rely on your craft.
Hang on a second.
Getting a little sound. Still with us?
Yeah, sorry. I just had an alarm go off in my house. Not a big deal.
Not alarming, in other words.
No. We're good.
Okay. All right, let's get back to Jane Levy's book a little bit, and then I want to talk to you about something that you mentioned off air, some writing you're doing on one of my favorite baseball characters, Leo DeRocher. And I, as you, early Polar Grounds attendee, I'm a few years ahead of you. I was there in 51 when the Giants had the Bobby Thompson miracle year, hit around the shot, heard around the world. I was 5 years old, and I was indoctrinated on the Giants. Leo was the manager at that time. He'd come from the Dodgers, and again, the most interesting character. He and Billy Martin tied in my mind for the most interesting character, on-field character of my time. Finish it up on Jane Levy, and we'll get to Leo.
Well, let me give you a segue, which is that one of the anecdotes that she retells quickly is the one about the conflict between Leo DeRocher when he was a young utility infielder with the Yankees, and he got into a literal fight with Babe Ruth, and you wouldn't think that fight would go very well for a little guy like DeRocher, but apparently he was a better street fighter than Ruth, and actually got the advantage of Ruth and sort of gave him a couple of quick sucker punches, knocked him into a locker, and within a couple of weeks, I think, he was on his way to St. Louis because Ruth ruled the roost around Yankee Stadium and, just wouldn't tolerate that kind of abuse. But he was an abusive guy. I think that's one of the adjectives that I would use to describe him. He was just willing to alienate people. And, one of the points that I made on the James site was to contrast him with somebody who played for him briefly in the late 40s, which was Gil Hodges. And you'll never see a stronger contrast than the contrast in personality and styles, in just the way he treated people, than, Gil Hodges, who was, a quiet guy, but very firm, and DeRocher, who was, very volatile and, would react very strongly and loudly to anybody who, he wanted to have a word with. And, one of the things that made the biggest impression on me was obviously watching this contrast in the late 1960s when DeRocher was managing the Cubs and Hodges was managing the Mets. And, that's one of the lessons, I think, that I really took to heart from watching baseball when I was growing up, which is that Hodges behaved in a way that everybody seemed to admire, and DeRocher behaved in a way that even his own players had issues with. His own players were, the ones who were being criticized and picked on and ridiculed by DeRocher, and I always thought, well, that's not a good way to handle people. I think I'd much rather be Gil Hodges, if I can do it, than a Leo DeRocher type of leader in any way, shape, or form.
I would have thought, because I was really into that 1969 season when the Miracle Mets, the Cubs were their main rivalry. And DeRocher was the manager. There was a great deal of irony there. And the way DeRocher handled Ernie Banks, kind of a fading superstar at the time, it said a lot about Leo and just the way he was so out of touch with the human side of baseball.
Well, another way to look at this would be just to talk about the styles of managing in general, that DeRocher was kind of representing a very old school way of managing a ball team, which is to say he was the boss and he didn't mind if his players felt a little persecuted, a little bit under, or even a lot under pressure to produce. And, if they were getting along or not didn't really seem to matter to him. And Hodges kind of represented the newer school. And, at this point in time, of course, we're almost 50 years past 1969. Hodges would be...
We've had 3 old school revolutions since then. Old school then... and old school in 1980 is totally different.
I'm saying that you look at things, they're all, different generations. So, to describe Hodges as a new generation just means that he was a newer generation than DeRocher, but certainly a strong contrast.
But what a managerial chain attributed to DeRocher. I think there's something like 12 big league managers that came from his either players that played under him or coached under him, Alvin Dark, to just name one, just a bunch of players. With DeRocher, there's always in life the exception that proves the rule. When DeRocher and Willie Mays came together, it changed things. It was the only time that I recall in DeRocher's career that he did soften. What brought that on? How was he able to suddenly become a father figure to Willie, a guidance, overly spoiled, some might say? But what triggered that in him?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would think that what triggered that in him was simply his recognizing the benefits of having a player with Mays' talents on his club. I mean, I don't think DeRocher was all that patient with young players. Like you say, the Mays example was one of the very few times that he actually would treat a young player with kindness and with patience and with unceasing support. You think about somebody, who a lot of people have compared to Mays. The Cubs had a young center fielder named Adolfo Phillips in DeRocher's tenure with the Cubs. And DeRocher was pretty much the same way. He compared Phillips to Mays. They were, similar ball players in some ways. They were both speedy center fielders with some power. But when Phillips wouldn't produce, when Phillips went into extended slumps, Leo was gone. He was not, from that point, supportive. So I don't think it was DeRocher's personality. I just think it was Mays' talent. I mean, he was very supportive of Mays. As you know, when Mays broke in, he broke in a slump and went something like 1 for 26 in his first couple of weeks. And DeRocher was supportive. He said, you're my center fielder as long as I'm here. You're my guy. Which I would doubt if he went on for another 26 at-bats. I mean, I'm pretty sure he just would have given up on Mays. But he also knew that Mays batted, I think, .477 in Minneapolis the year before. So he knew he had, genuine talent there, and he could see, with his eyes just how Mays looked on the field, on the base paths, with the bat. And I just think that it was, Mays rather than DeRocher who's the main reason that DeRocher was able to have such a supportive relationship. I mean, is that the way you saw it? You actually saw these games playing. I just read about it in books.
Oh, absolutely. Me too, for the most part, even though I was there in 51. I was a kid. I mean, literally a kid, 5 years old. But my grandfather and I, in 51, attended virtually every Saturday Ladies' Day. Half the time we brought my grandmother with us, or they brought me with them, I might say. But the legend is what it's about. And we get that from reading, and that's how important the written word is, and that's what gives you salvation at times. You know that what you're recording will be looked at as, in essence, a history book. The subject is baseball, but it's history nevertheless. DeRocher always compared Willie to Pete Reiser. Dodgers center fielder, came up in the 40s and was very injury prone, would run into walls and what have you. But apparently he had as much talent going for him as any of these guys. Mays, Mantle coming up. DeRocher really rang his bell a lot. Gave him a lot of credit. Anything you know about Pete Reiser that you want to share, or anything about the DeRocher-Reiser relationship that comes to mind?
Well, the one thing that I have to add about DeRocher as the manager of the Dodgers is that was my first encounter with DeRocher when I was a kid. I inherited a lot of baseball books. And this one I still have with me. This is a book Leo wrote when he was the manager of the Dodgers in the early 40s. And he wrote a book called The Dodgers and Me. And I found out very recently that this particular volume is one that I've had for a long time. It's been in my family, I guess, since the early 40s. But that I actually have an autographed copy of this book. He inscribed it, I think, to my Uncle Larry, to Lawrence, sincerely Leo DeRocher, and you can tell that it's, written in pen. So this is actually a valuable book. But it was valuable in another sense, which is that I got to understand DeRocher's managing when he might have been a more sympathetic figure. In other words, this is before he, switched over from the Dodgers to the Giants, and before he became the manager of the Cubs, who I despised in the late 60s, and before he became a cranky old manager with the Houston Astros, where he pretty much alienated every young player, old player, and everything in between on that Astros team. So this one, DeRocher was a good guy and a positive thinker, and a lot of what he had to say about early Dodgers stars like Reiser was very positive, very supportive, and he was combative in those days, but not nearly with all the baggage that he brought to all his later jobs. I mean, it seems to me he was pretty good at making enemies, as good as anybody I've ever seen.
I wonder, was that book co-written by Harold Parrott?
It wasn't. As far as I can tell, and this is what kind of amazed me. I mean, it probably was co-written with Harold Parrott, but I don't think Parrott got any credit, because one of the things I was noticing was how well written the book was. And DeRocher, as you know, got his education mostly in pool halls, and
right.
you know, that was probably among the more savory places where he got his education. It's like, I have a hard time imagining that DeRocher was that skillful a writer that he was actually able to write this book, but it's a very well-written book.
Must have been. How about his biography, That Nice Guys Finish Last? That was co-written by, I think it was Ed Lynn, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure was.
Okay. I've read that 2 or 3 different times. It's just a terrific journal. How much of it is fiction? How much of it is nonfiction?
Well, you know, Lynn was a pretty good writer, although there are places where I've gone through some of Lynn's stuff, and I've run a couple of what Bill James calls tracers, where I try to just track down the actual events of things that anybody writes about, and just sort of show where they vary from the historical record. And I caught Lynn in a couple of places, you know, I wouldn't say making things up, but either exaggerating or omitting some facts that should be in the record. But for the most part, you know, Lynn is pretty much concerned with accuracy rather than, you know, with telling extravagant stories. And, you know, for the most part, I think that is a pretty accurate rendition.
Okay. And the last thing I want to ask you about Leo was his relationship with Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would, you know, cite again what I'd said about Mays. Leo was obviously very good at recognizing talent, and I think, you know, one of the first things that anybody could see just watching Jackie Robinson step on a ball field was that was a ball player. And, you know, I mean, one of the, I guess, the best testaments to Leo's good character would be how he, you know, sided with Jackie when he first came to the Dodgers, and he just said to the you know, racists and grumblers on the Dodgers team that, you know, this guy's going to make us all a lot of money, and you know, anybody who doesn't, you know, want to play with him, we'll just find a way for you to get out of the Dodger organization. And he had a lot of support, obviously, from Rickey in taking that position, but you know, he was pretty pivotal, I think, in having Jackie accepted as a member of the Dodgers because he could play ball. I'm sure that if Jackie didn't have the talent that he did, you know, DeRocher wouldn't have had the support for him that he had. But, you know, that's probably the single most admirable thing I can find about Leo DeRocher's character was that he recognized that Jackie Robinson had, you know, more talent than anybody else, and that, you know, he would help the Dodgers win a lot of pennants, which obviously history proves out.
And let's not understate what tumultuous times they were in terms of players protesting Jackie's existence. There was a petition going around. He quelched that, and he did make a stand, he and Rickey, Mr. Rickey, that anyone who didn't want to play on this team, just let us know and you'll be gone. And I admire him for that. I said it was my last question. There was one more book written about DeRocher that comes to mind. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Asinsky.
I'm not sure if I know that book.
Okay. A scathing biography of DeRocher written in the 80s. And I'll look it up and send you a link to it, and maybe we can talk about that on a future podcast. Not a bad first effort, young man.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, Ralph. Great having a conversation with you.
Beautiful. We'll keep it going. And again, the name of the show, crediting your younger brother Mike, Thrown from a Moving Vehicle. And Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, I'm delighted. This was fun.
Thanks a bunch, Ralph.
All right. We'll be back when we're back. And thanks for listening, everybody. The maiden edition. Great. Thank you again, Steve Goldleaf. Adios. The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.